Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. It's been a while, right? If you've been following along with this series, I'm sorry that I took such a massive break in the middle. I was just so busy at work. I just had no time at all for this. And I'm not on social media or anything, so I don't have any kind of place to let anybody know. It's just, I just kind of disappeared, I guess, for like 5 weeks or something. So really sorry about that if you've been following. Yeah, blame my job, blame my work. But anyway, we're just going to jump straight back into it today. We're still in section 2, interiority and economy. And we're looking at part C. The first part of today's video is going to look at part C, I and dependence. And then, because this one's quite short, and the next section, section D, is actually quite long, I'm going to do half of D today in this video. And that's the dwelling. So anyway, section 2, interiority and economy, and we'll go through part C and half of part D. So now let's have a look at the first part, I and dependence. And the first subsection is enjoyment and uncertainty. Okay, so this part actually, part C, I and dependence, it's actually quite good. It's good timing because there's quite a bit of revision here. Small section, lots of kind of covering of ground that we've already looked at. Which is perfect if, like me, you're coming back to this, picking up totality and infinity after that 5 or was it 6 weeks? Hopefully not 6 weeks, but yeah, that little hiatus. So let's break this down. We talked about, a couple of videos ago, we've talked about the uncertainty of the future. And this came from what Levinas called the elemental. So that elemental, if you remember, is the that source of qualities that we live within. He calls it the milieu, or the background of on which our lives kind of play out. But the elemental, it's something that we can't see a kind of a source here. We don't see where it comes from. We just find ourselves in the midst of it, living on the earth, living surrounded by the air, and you know, I think another part of the elemental he talked about was the sea, the ocean. It's too big, it seems to lack a specific source. It's just the quality. It's imbued with a quality, the elemental, imbued with a quality, but there's no substance behind it. And so that means that there's this kind of a source of insecurity where our whole lives are grounded in this background, this elemental, but we don't know what it is. We can't see a specific substance to get a grip on it. So it's a source of anxiety. And that, the elemental, we talked about this kind of extending into the there is for Levinas, which is basically pure existence itself. Those are some of the words that he uses to describe this. But again, there is something we just have no real frame of reference for understanding. It's just brute existence, I think, is the way he describes it somewhere. And that's kind of what the elemental ends up being for us. It just fades into this just pure existing. There's nothing specific, there's nothing individual or particular, nothing we can really grasp intellectually here. And the elemental reminds enjoyment that its independence envelops a dependence. So we're dependent on this elemental. It's kind of a check, if you like, on our freedom. It reminds us that at the core of our existence, there is this dependence on this thing which is fundamentally unknowable. So that's that. But despite the fact that it's a source of insecurity, this uncertainty that is in the core of our being, it doesn't undermine happiness, because there's no I first to which happiness is added. If that were the case, there was an I first, there was pure existence first, I existed, and then I was happy on top of that, then this uncertainty could affect that happiness, because it's added, the uncertainty is added to our lives in the same way that the happiness would be. But that's not the case, because the I only crystallizes in enjoyment. The I is happiness, fundamentally. So having this source of anxiety, this uncertainty in the elemental, doesn't jeopardize that happiness, that enjoyment, because the I is fundamentally enjoyment. That's kind of Levinas' starting position there. All right, the second subsection is the love of life. So in this part, so we're still just talking about enjoyment, right? The fundamental mode of existence, if you like. What the I is. The I is fundamentally enjoyment. So this is a fundamental truth of human existence for Levinas, the love of life. It comes with his philosophy, which is, I've mentioned this before, but it's quite refreshing to see this positive take on human existence. I mean, in existentialism, we're so often, it seems to be emphasizing all these negative characteristics, anguish and death and all of these absurdity, all of these things kind of seem to be more prevalent. But yeah, for Levinas, the fundamental truth is enjoyment. And he talks in this section about rejecting life, and what he wants to discuss is the situation where we don't feel like enjoyment and happiness make up the core of our existence. So certain events or certain givens of a situation, they don't give us happiness, and we want to, on that ground, we want to kind of reject life and say that, or reject Levinas's position perhaps, and say, life is not happiness. Enjoyment is not the center of is not the fundamental truth of human existence. For Levinas, he says that this, even when we feel events happen, things take place that we don't enjoy, that don't give us happiness, they don't affect this fundamental value for Levinas of enjoyment, because every opposition to life ultimately takes refuge in life and refers to its values. So you can't kind of get outside of life to say you reject this notion that there's happiness, because any position you take, you're taking another position in life, obviously, or you wouldn't be able to take any position at all. So in order to reject one part of life, certain aspects, you must be endorsing others. And so there is still this, maybe you don't realize it, but there's still this fundamental love of life at the bottom, even while you are rejecting other parts of it, even while you're rejecting certain parts of it. Every opposition to life ends up taking refuge in another part of life. This is something similar to what Merleau-Ponty said in Phenomenology of Perception. He talked about skepticism in general, and the way that you can't It doesn't make sense to be skeptical about everything, because there must be a ground for you to be skeptical about anything in the first place. You must be grounded somewhere in some way. So you can't deny everything. And he says something very similar to this. In order to deny one thing or reject one thing, you must be taking a position somewhere else. You must be standing somewhere. You must be grounded in some other place. And Levinas goes on to say something very similar, where he says that we can't reject the whole of being. Being is here nowise refused in its totality. In its opposition to being, the I seeks refuge in being itself. And that's basically just what I was saying, the impossibility of rejecting being or life completely, because it's self-defeating, right? Rejecting the whole of being, including the self that you are, doing the rejecting, means there's nothing left. There's nothing left. There's nothing left to be doing any rejecting. So the rejection itself is taking a position, is endorsing life. And he goes on to say, he talk about suicide a little bit as well. And for Levinas, suicide is tragic because it dispenses with the I, gets rid of the I. But this is not the problem, right? The I is fundamentally enjoyment for Levinas. So getting rid of the I is not fixing whatever problem there was. That's the good thing. That's the one thing you should be keeping. The I is fundamentally happiness. Even despair and suffering doesn't break with this ideal of joy for Levinas. So getting rid of the I, in suicide, is kind of tackling the whole problem in the wrong way. You're getting rid of the wrong thing. That's not the thing you should be trying to destroy. And that's why suicide is tragic for Levinas. It just it identifies a problem. Maybe there are givens of a particular situation that it doesn't like. But instead of dealing with those, it takes away the one thing that is good, the one thing that should be giving enjoyment, should be giving happiness. Because it is happiness for Levinas. So suicide's tragic because the person committing suicide hasn't really understood that. They've missed this fundamental truth. Okay, so that's the love of life. And the final little subsection for this first part is enjoyment and separation. Okay, so enjoyment is separation, right? To be I, atheist, at home with oneself, separated, happy, created, these are synonyms. Okay, so again, revision, right? We've talked about this before. So there's nothing really to add to that. But just let's keep going though. Separation cannot be a thesis or the antithesis, because if it were, then the separation would be absorbed into a totality. So it can't be, if we reduce it to this, one part, a thesis, a statement, a proposition against which another proposition can be made, or the antithesis, the kind of the negation of the thesis, then we're subsuming it into a totality. That's not what this is. It's not what this can be. So just keep that in mind. And that means that the transcendental cannot be derived from the separated being, and vice versa. The separated being cannot be derived from the transcendental, because there's no totality there. There's no way to go from one to the other. If you could, then we're wrapping things up in this totality, and we don't have the separation that is so important for Levinas. And this is going to become important in the next part when we look at the dwelling. Okay, we've got that separation, and there's no connection from once I make that break into the I that I am to be, then I am. It's a complete break. There's nothing connecting me to anything else, which would leave me as one half of a totality, as one part of a totality. So I have to be completely separated. However, there must be some connection still. There must be some way of a connection being open here, or there would be nothing else. It would just be me, just be I wrapped up in this interiority, which I am, this separated interiority. So Levinas says the interiority must be closed. I must not derive from the other, but it must also be open in a way, so that the other can speak to it, so that there is a pathway here out of this interiority. I've separated myself off. I'm wrapped up in this interiority, which is complete in itself, but there must be a way out, or then I wouldn't have any of the experiences that Levinas is talking about. The other wouldn't exist for me, wouldn't be a problem for me. And that opening is precisely this concern for the morrow, Levinas says, this insecurity of the future that we saw open up in the elemental. That is the chink in the armor of interiority. That's the way that we can get out of this completely enclosed interiority in which we are wrapped up. And the next section, the dwelling, will explain how this arises and how we're able to go from this completely separated atheistic being to having the capacity to experience the other, to kind of break out of our own prison, if you want to call it that, if I can call it that. And the way that we do it is through that uncertainty, and this will all take place through habitation, labor, economy, and possession. These are some of the key words that will come up in the next section. And it's really interesting. So let's jump into the next part, looking at the D part of section 2, the dwelling. And we'll start with habitation. All right, so in habitation, we're talking about the home. And the home is usually seen as an end, as the last part of kind of a referential chain, a web of a relational, as part of a relational whole, where we need shelter, or we need to be warm, we need a place to live. And so we have, at the end of a chain of references and relations, we end up with this dwelling, this home to live in. Or it's also seen as something we enjoy, something that makes us feel safe, makes us feel comfortable, right? That's what the home is. And while these are true, neither of them capture the essence of home as a dwelling or as habitation for Levinas. So what does he mean when he talks about the home as dwelling? The home or dwelling for Levinas is the condition of all human activity. And this means that rather than being the end of a process, the end of the last point of a series or sequence of needs or desires that have to be met, culminating in this ultimate thing, the home. For Levinas, it's the starting point. It's the condition for all human activity. So it's what we have to have before we can do anything at all. And so that means there are three things which I want to note in relation to this. First, it's paradoxically the home, the start point of all human activity, is paradoxically outside in the world, which it makes possible for the I. This inwardness opens up in a home which is situated in that outside. For the home as a building belongs to a world of objects. But this belongingness does not nullify the bearing of the fact that every consideration of objects, and of buildings too, is produced out of a dwelling. Concretely speaking, the dwelling is not situated in the object of world, but the object of world is situated by relation to my dwelling. So that's a really good quote. It captures the core of this, I think. Consciousness of a world is already consciousness through that world. As soon as we are we're living in the world, we've already had our start point. We've already started that life, not from some disengaged, reflective, intellectual point somewhere outside the world. We've already gotten our start through the world. So before the world even appears to us, we're already affected by it. We're already influenced in some way by it, because it conditions our start point. And this is basically just Levinas's way of saying that we are not disembodied immaterial minds first, and then we kind of are put into the world. We are what we are only through the world in the first place, only through a home, through a dwelling. And it's through that dwelling that we come to know the world. But the dwelling is already in the world. So it's kind of like we're already influenced and affected by the world before we even know it. Because that's the precondition for knowing the world. I'm kind of going around in circles a little bit, but this is an idea that everybody's talked about. Merleau-Ponty talks about it, Sartre's talked about it, Heidegger talked about it. So is that same idea kind of coming up again? We're not originally a transcendental mind somewhere, which is kind of then put into the world, or finds itself in the world, which is the exact opposite of the way that I guess typically Western philosophy has seen us. We've seen ourselves first and foremost as minds, right? And then we've tried to understand the connection between the mind and the body, and the mind and the world. But that's approaching it all backwards. There is no disembodied mind first. First is this existence in the world. Through a dwelling, through a home. And so the home, or the dwelling for Levinas, is in the world of objects. It is a physical building, a place, but it has the value of something more. It has more to it. There is more to it than just another object in the world amongst all the other objects. Kind of like the body in this way. Right. The same could be said about the body. The body is a physical object, but it's not just a physical object. It's also, for my body, for me, is also that by which other objects appear, that through which other objects appear. And Levinas is saying the same thing here about the home, the dwelling. Another point worth noting is he talks about contemplation or recollection here. And I think these are synonyms. And another synonym here is reflection. So all of these words, contemplation, recollection, reflection, they all have the same sense of stepping back from the situation, from the lived situation in which we are immersed, and distancing ourselves from it. So contemplation or recollection is I think the main word that Levinas wants to use. Recollection, which we normally think constitutes the world from nowhere and out of nothing, i.e. Descartes, is actually starting from the midst of the world, therefore is conditioned by it. I kind of mentioned this already, I kind of emphasized it in the first part, but we're influenced by the world. We're not this disengaged, separate being which constitutes everything. We're not creating mental representations of this world which is completely separate from us. We are already starting from the midst of it. That's where the dwelling is. So yeah, that's just kind of the flip side to talking about recollection. And that is what's important to note about that. I don't know if you've been caught up by this or not, but it took me ages to figure this out, because I was thinking that this recollection, this contemplation, is the same as separation, the kind of separation, and Levinas calls it atheism, that separation of the I, which makes the I, which causes the I to arise in the first place. But this is a completely different sense. This stepping back from the situation is nothing to do with the separation in which the I emerges in the first place. So, and I forget if Levinas uses the word separation, but when I saw that, he might, or maybe I just put it in there myself, but it was that was really causing me problems, because this idea of separation, recollection, separating us from that enjoyment, that living from, that was really throwing me for a loop. So this is completely different from that. The situation here is we already exist in enjoyment. We're already living from. And this recollection, this contemplation, is a stepping back from that. But it's not constituting the world. We're not creating the world in terms of representations. The world is already there. We've already been thrown into the world. Levinas hates that term, so we won't say thrown into the world, but we're already immersed in the world, if you like. And there's one more point I wanted to make concerning this notion of the dwelling. And it's actually more about, it's okay, it combines the two. So recollection, this act of reflecting, stepping back, achieves this distance from living from that just direct, imminent mode of existence. Recollection achieves that distance from life lived in enjoyment through the dwelling, through economic existence. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But that's the important point. Recollection is made possible through the dwelling, through having this home from which I can live in a slightly different way. Originally, I was living in this mode of pure enjoyment, this mode of what Levinas calls living from. Right? It's a direct, imminent way of living where we're not reflecting. We haven't stepped back from the world to consider it as a world, to understand it, to kind of intellectually grasp it as a world. We're just immersed in living it. And what recollection is the stepping back. But in order to do that, that's what the dwelling facilitates. That's what the home facilitates. And recollection, then, he says, is concretized. I'm not sure if that's, I think he's made that word up, concretized, made concrete as existence. It's concretized as existence, it's made real, it's made concrete as existence in a dwelling. So that's what that's the importance of the dwelling. And I just realized this is very much like Levinas's. I can see the parallel. I haven't seen it before, but this is like Levinas's take of the fall, the Garden of Eden and the fall from grace. We're living in the Garden of Eden in this mode of enjoyment, this purely immanent, purely engaged mode of enjoyment where everything is directly lived rather than reflected on. Once we make this once recollection comes to the fore through the dwelling, that's the beginning of the fall. We're now we're falling into a less original, less authentic, maybe mode of existence. Interesting. But I wanted to show you a diagram that I made just to try and capture some of this. So what we have then is the separated being first, living from, so in that mode of enjoyment, and they achieve this distance from that mode through the act of recollection or representation. And recollection or representation is only possible and is produced concretely in the interiority of a home, habitation, in a dwelling. So that's kind of a way to just visualize what we're talking about. So then the question for Levinas at this point is, how is this recollection affected in the middle of living from? We are engaged in this enjoyment. We're living from everything. Everything is imminent. There's nothing impinging on us from outside. We're completely completely isolated, and we're totally happy in our isolation. But then we have this recollection, this representation, this distancing ourselves from that life. In recollection through the dwelling. But how does this happen? How does this come about? And the answer for Levinas, or part of the answer, is our next section, the feminine. All right, so the feminine, man, this whole thing has just made sense to me. I've just put the pieces together. Okay, this is really good, actually. So let's get into this. So we've got living from. That's that original mode of separation. Spontaneous enjoyment. That's what that is. It's happiness, but in the midst of this enjoyment, there arises recollection. And Levinas also calls this recollection a familiarity and intimacy and a feeling of gentleness. These really kind of threw me for a loop when I was trying to figure out when I was trying to make my way through this section. What is he talking about here? Now I get it, actually. And I'll tell you what I think in a minute. But anyway, that's what we've got. This recollection as an intimacy or a feeling of gentleness arises. And so he says, for this recollection to take place, there must be a prior intimacy. So we've got this familiarity, this intimacy of recollection, but there must be, in order for it to take place, a prior intimacy. And this would be an intimacy with someone. So not just an intimacy of ourselves in our recollection, but for this to take place, there must be another intimacy that would make such that would make the distancing of recollection possible. And this intimacy, this prior intimacy, is with someone. So recollection refers to a world already human, refers to a world that already has someone else in it. But this human, this someone else that we're talking about, is not the transcendent other, which manifests in discourse. We've talked about this before, the other kind of appearing as the face and all of that stuff as from that distance of infinity that we're never able to grasp. That's not the other that we're talking about here. This someone, someone with whom we share an intimate relationship, is not the transcendent other that we've talked about before. The presence of the other must not only be revealed in the face, which breaks through its own plastic image, but must be revealed simultaneously with this presence in its withdrawal and in its absence. And the other whose presence is discreetly an absence, with which is accomplished the primary hospitable welcome which describes the field of intimacy, is the woman. The woman is the condition for recollection, the interiority of the home, and inhabitation. Okay, so first let's look at this. So okay, I think we've got the basics of this. The other is not only that transcendent other that we talked about, the one that revealed in the face, which breaks through its own plastic image, but it's also this other that we've discovered. And this one doesn't reveal in a presence through language, but is revealed in a withdrawal and an absence. So why absence? That's I think the first thing to tackle. I'm not sure that Levinas answers this actually, but what I've been able to gather is that the transcendent other, the other which we're never able to establish any relation with, any firm relation, manifests as revelation through language, right? So there's this, first of all, there's a presence in the sense of the language, discourse. It's overt. It's even though it's from a place which we're unable to have a relation with, we're unable to form a totality with, there is a presence there, and it's a presence through language. It's this revelation from on high, if you like, from beyond our ken. But the other that we're talking about here must be capable of producing a field of intimacy. So this is a very different sense. We're not talking about another which is through which all we have is this kind of mode of revelation through language. They're generating this field of intimacy here. And that means it must, for this to happen, for this to be produced, it must be the case that we're not dealing with this kind of overt revelation. And so Levinas calls this the field of intimacy generated by the woman a wordless welcome. So this is not, and he's emphasizing this, the discourse language through which we encounter the transcendent other, and here the lack of language, which creates a field of intimacy, which opens up, if you like, the space for recollection to take place in a dwelling. It opens up the home in which recollection can take place. Okay, so that's the first part. The second thing I want to mention in relation to that quote is the woman. Why woman? Why the feminine here? And this is what Levinas says. The feminine has been encountered in this analysis as one of the cardinal points of the horizon in which the inner life takes place. And the empirical absence of the human being of feminine sex in a dwelling no wise affects the dimension of femininity which remains open there as the very welcome of the dwelling. So, okay, he's trying to get out of this notion that it's got to be a woman, like an actual female presence. And when I was trying to understand this, imagined maybe it's kind of feminine, like the yin-yang idea, right? Where yin it's not a gendered idea, it's not a gender idea, it's more the qualities that of half of the universe, if you like, qualities that half of that make the whole. It's part of the qualities that make up the whole: darkness, passivity, gentleness, and the feminine's included there, as opposed to the yang, the lightness, the activity, the assertion, and that's associated with the masculine. So maybe I was like, oh, okay, that could maybe work here. All rubbish. That's all rubbish. I've just realised. And Levinas is also talking nonsense when he, in that quote, that's nothing to do with the reason he's using the feminine. It's all about religion for Levinas here. So what I said before in the earlier section, in living from enjoyment, that's the Garden of Eden, right? That's our unfallen state, our natural state. And then we have this fall through recollection, through the dwelling, into this the fallen state, I guess. That's what Levinas is describing here. That's the religious parallel. Now, how did the fall take place in the Bible? It was Eve, right? Woman. And the temptress. And that's exactly what Levinas is describing here. And that's exactly why he chose the woman. I can't believe I didn't see this earlier. And it also explains why he called recollection familiarity and intimacy and a feeling of gentleness. Because he's setting it up for the temptress to lure us with this feeling of gentleness, intimacy, the welcome of the home. It's all a religious metaphor, which is supremely disappointing. As always, anytime the religion takes kind of precedence over the philosophy, always a disappointment, and doubly so because this is good stuff. Actually, I think get rid of the whole fall from grace and the intimations that of Eve kind of tempting the man away. It's all Adam, whatever. Get rid of all of that, and this is still good stuff. This is still, it stands on its own as good, solid philosophy. But yeah, where it really breaks down here, I think, is the notion of the feminine. If we don't have that notion, if we just get rid of the woman from this and say that the other still facilitates this warm welcome of the dwelling, it still works. It's still good philosophy. But yeah, Levinas has totally shot himself in the foot with this kind of, well, it's overt now that I've seen it, but before with this kind of covert attempt to legitimize his religious faith, obviously. So yeah, whatever he says about the feminine being a cardinal point of blah blah blah, that's cover, because this is definitely Levinas's take on the fall from the Bible. But like I said, ignore that and we've got good philosophy. So the last quote I have actually does just that. Have a listen to it. The other who welcomes an intimacy is not the you of the face that reveals itself in a dimension of height, but precisely the thou of familiarity, a language without teaching, a silent language, an understanding without words, an expression in secret. The I-thou in which Buber sees the category of interhuman relationship is the relation not with the interlocutor, but with feminine alterity. He killed himself in the very last bit there. Feminine alterity, I didn't see that. So yeah, if we just ignore that, this is all good stuff. And that link to Buber is quite nice too, the I-thou. So the I-thou relationship is prior to Levinas's other, the transcendence of Levinas's, like capital O other, I guess we could say, the other, the other in which their alterity is always maintained, is always respected. But anyway, so that kind of answers how recollection comes about through. For Levinas, it's the feminine, but for us, we could maybe say it's the other, but not the other, the transcendental other, not the transcendent other. And I want to just show you go back to that habitation chain of mine, that diagram, so we can expand on it now and see that in addition to the separated being going through recollection to the interiority of the home, now we've seen how this recollection is possible. And it starts with the woman, who manifests with a presence which is discreetly an absence. That's creating that field of intimacy, kind of opening that space in which recollection becomes possible. And then that leads to dwelling in the home, and we'll look at in more detail what the home is, and how this kind of completes. I guess for Levinas, he's thinking about the fall, how it completes our fall from grace. But for us, for those of us who are not so interested in the religious parallels that Levinas is trying to draw, it will tell us how kind of everyday existence, our life in the everyday mode that we normally live it, as opposed to that more imminent living from an enjoyment, which is still valid despite Levinas's kind of muddying the water with notions of the Garden of Eden. Yeah. So let's have a look at a summary. So we talked about, in the first part, we did a bit of revision, looked at enjoyment and the love of life. The two main ideas from this, one was that we can't reject life, because in rejecting a part of life, you necessarily endorse others or other parts. And you definitely can't reject life as a whole, which is more like a skeptical attitude, because for the same reason, in order to reject everything, you must be standing somewhere. The other important point from there was that suicide is tragic for Levinas, and the reason is it gets rid of precisely the thing which is not the problem. Gets rid of the I, but the I is the thing which is happiness, which is enjoyment. Then we looked at habitation, and basically what this is, it's the way that recollection achieves distance from living from inner dwelling. So this recollecting, stepping back from, kind of distancing ourselves from that more, I hesitate to use the word, but pure, more original, more authentic mode of existence, of living from. Recollection achieves this through habitation in a dwelling, and the home or the dwelling is the condition of all human activity. That was kind of an important point for Levinas. It's the start point, not the final point in kind of a chain of, in a causal chain, if you like, or what's not even part of a referential totality. It's what starts everything for us. And a key aspect of this notion of the home or the dwelling is that it's outside in the world that it makes possible. It's already outside in the world, in that world. So we're already influenced. We're already a part of the world. We've already been affected by it as soon as we start to recognize it and come to know it. The other part of today's video was the feminine, and this enables recollection by providing a field of intimacy. So we talked about the way that opens up this kind of space for recollection in the dwelling, for recollection to take place in a dwelling. And this is not a transcendence or revelation through language. So it's not the other as transcendence. It's not that absolute alterity of the other. Because the feminine accomplishes this field of intimacy through an absence. So without words. It's a wordless gesture, a feeling of a welcome that doesn't teach, that doesn't even talk. And finally, Levinas connects this with Buber's I thou, which was a nice way of I think that's a nice connection point of connection there. So it's prior to that absolutely the absolute alterity of the other that we've discussed prior to this. Okay, nice. So that's kind of the that first half of habitate of the dwelling. The second half of that section we'll look at in the next video, and we get into things like possession, labor, economy, and that's really interesting. So just stick tight for that, and from now on it should be smooth sailing. A video a week, that's my goal. Hopefully I can't see how I could be pulled away for some ridiculous amount of time like I was before. Sorry again for that if anybody was left in the lurch, but yeah, what can you do? I've got to work, I've got to make a living. All right, thanks everyone for listening. I'll see you in the next video.